In introducing the early radio acts, we discussed two important functions that the U.S. government plays in regulating the radio spectrum. First, the government allocates portions of the spectrum to different uses. Second, the government assigns licenses to specific users. We'll now look more closely at how the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, has allocated and assigned spectrum over time. Looking at the FCC's approach to broadcast television illustrates some of the challenges of the command and control model created by the Radio Acts. Consider first the FCC's approach to allocation. In the early 1940s, the FCC licensed television stations on an experimental basis. In 1945, the FCC developed a more comprehensive band plan for television. The plan established 12 channels, 2 through 13, in the VHF, very high frequency spectrum, relocating FM radio stations to make room for TV stations. Under the plan, the FCC spaced stations apart to create a minimum geographic distance between those stations using the same channel and between stations using adjacent channels. In developing this plan, the FCC resisted calls to allocate large swaths of spectrum in the UHF or ultra-high frequency band to broadcast television. Spectrum that some broadcasters argued could be used to support color or higher definition television. Within 3 years, it became clear that the FCC had not allocated enough spectrum to meet post-war demands for TV. The FCC was under pressure to reduce the spacing between stations and to allow more stations on the air. As significant interference developed, it became clear that the FCC could not continue to assign licenses, and it issued a temporary freeze to allow it to consider options to expand the spectrum available for broadcast television. The freeze lasted 4 years until the FCC issued a new television band plan. The plan retained 12 channels, channels 2 through 13 in VHF, and added 70 channels, channels 14 through 83 in UHF. The new plan sought to avoid interference by increasing the minimum distance between stations in different geographic areas using the same channel, and between stations using adjacent channels. The order also intermixed VHF and UHF stations within the same broadcast markets. In practice, this plan made far fewer channels available to viewers than the FCC had expected. First, channels were reserved for communities that simply could not support them, but those channels were then unavailable for use in nearby communities. Second, the spacing requirements for channels reduced the number of channels the FCC could assign. Third, the intermixing of VHF and UHF stations presented distinct disadvantages for UHF stations. Those stations had to compete against established VHF stations when sets capable of receiving VHF and UHF signals were not widely available. As a result, spectrum was tied up in stations that could not be successful. In short, key FCC decisions made the broadcast market far less competitive than it otherwise might have been. As technology changes rapidly, it can be difficult to predict how much spectrum will be needed to support a particular use.